Welcome to today's episode of the Normalized Surrogacy Podcast by Surrogacy Mentor. I'm your host, Carrie Flamer Powell, experienced gestational surrogate, surrogacy agency founder, and owner of Surrogacy Mentor, where our aim is to help surrogates match with reputable surrogacy agencies for a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Today, I'm happy to welcome our special guest, Kaitlyn Oberly of Seed Trust Escrow. Welcome, Kaitlyn.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here.
Absolutely. So before we dig into our topic today, which is nightmare escrow cases in surrogacy, I want to give a little bio on you so our listeners and viewers know a little bit about your background. So Kaitlyn Oberly, Seed Trust Senior Partner Success Director, is a graduate from Troy University and holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in biology and an ABA certificate in paralegal studies from the University of California, San Diego. Kaitlyn has over 8 years of experience within the art industry, having begun her paralegal career at the Surrogacy Law Center and then joining Seed Trust Escrow in 2019. While at Seed Trust, she has carefully guided families through the escrow process during their surrogacy and egg donor journeys. She thoroughly enjoys working with intended parents, surrogates, and their agencies, and is committed to providing expertise surrounding escrow best practices. So welcome again, Kaitlyn. Great to have you. And I'm excited about our topic today.
Absolutely. Same as I.
So before we jump in, just give us like a 2-minute or less refresher on escrow services and how they play into surrogacy. What's the purpose and where does the escrow come in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like many people, when they think in terms of escrow, they think in terms of, home escrow and not particularly with surrogacy escrow services. However, it is such a viable part for surrogacy journey. An escrow account is a centralized account that holds the funds for a surrogacy journey. This account's going to be used to disperse those funds based off the terms of that gestational surrogacy agreement that the intended parents and the surrogate sign. What this escrow account's going to allow is a centralized location to hold those funds. It's also going to ensure that the payments being processed are per that gestational surrogacy agreement. So we're not processing those payments that falls, outside that agreement. And then it kind of just provides a peace of mind for the intended parents, knowing that there's a centralized account that holds the funds for their surrogacy journey, and then peace of mind for the surrogate, knowing that those funds are also in a centralized account and going to be, used for the surrogacy journey.
Yes. I like that you related it to real estate because I think a lot of people listening probably have purchased a house before. And so, when you buy a house, you have to put down escrow money or earnest money, and that goes into an escrow account. And I think if people understand it in that sense, like when you do it in a real estate transaction, the real estate contract dictates how that money is spent, when it's spent, if it's spent or not spent, if it's refunded, right? So The same thing applies with surrogacy. You're depositing funds into an escrow account that's separate from everybody that's involved. And the surrogacy contract is what's dictating when does that money get spent? How does it get spent? Does it get spent? Does it get refunded? All the different things, right? So it's similar in that sense, but very specific to each piece of the surrogacy journey.
Exactly. And, all of those payments are going to be based off that agreement. And so if there are any types of payments that do fall outside the agreement, then we're going to need, approval from all parties that it's okay to process those payments. But yeah, that legal contract really governs what's coming out of that escrow account.
So now let's start digging into what everyone's tuning in to talk about, which is, 99% of the time, things go great, right? With surrogacy in general. And with the escrow account, it's pretty straightforward, right? You have a contract, you put the money in the account, and then it's facilitated per the contract. But there's always those times when things don't happen the way we expect them to. So let's talk about your first example of a nightmare escrow case and what happened. And then we'll kind of talk about what could have been done to prevent this.
Yeah, absolutely. So first I want to say I love how you kind of preface it with, most of the time surrogacy journeys go the way they're intended to go. However, you do have that small percentage where, kind of goes a little bump in the night a little bit, where things are unexpected, or maybe individuals are on a different page when it comes specifically to processing of funds. What I would see traditionally is when these nightmare cases do arise in escrow, it's generally when one individual perceives a provision differently than the other individual, or maybe they're thinking that that certain payments should be processed that maybe are not per the terms of that agreement, or vice versa. Maybe, one party is under the impression that a payment should go out and the other party doesn't believe that, they've met all the terms for that payment to go out. So that is traditionally what we see causes the start of a nightmare case. Again, like you said, most of the time these payments go exactly how they're planned, but there are those kind of mishaps. So that kind of gets me into, obviously with escrow, we've seen not numerous, but there are a few nightmare cases, and they do kind of seem to follow the same trend of when, what causes the nightmare case. And these topics seem to be similar. So kind of the first one I wanted to touch on was the escrow provision when it comes to closing out escrow, and how important that this really is. So we had a case a few years ago where the intended parents met with their attorney. This was during the contract phase, and they actually negotiated out the closing provision for escrow. So what I mean by that is, traditionally when you have a surrogacy contract, there is a provision in there that states how long the escrow account needs to remain open after the delivery of the child, or after some type of event that occurs within the pregnancy or the surrogacy journey. Well, this particular provision was completely removed. So meaning the escrow account can be closed at any time. There was this situation, the surrogate was pregnant, and her companion had gone to a doctor's appointment, and the surrogate had submitted for companion travel expenses. And a dispute arose between the intended parents and the surrogate, where the intended parent didn't feel that, these travel expenses fell within the terms of that agreement, and got upset because the payment was processed per the terms of the agreement, and ended up closing the escrow account out mid-pregnancy. We personally could not do anything because there was no provision that stated that the escrow account needed to remain open for a certain amount of time. So this kind of let everyone very much exposed, the agency that was involved, the surrogate especially, attorneys, escrow. And because now what you have is intended parents paying the surrogate directly for her surrogacy journey and those remaining payments, instead of it being, held in a third party escrow account where it's going to be compared to the terms of the agreement. Now you have intended parents kind of getting to decide what gets paid and what does not get paid. What I can say about that, and it was a very unfortunate circumstance, and there was honestly nothing legally we could do, and it left everyone very much exposed. The surrogate, would reach out to us. She was so concerned with getting her payments. And that's why I just want to bring up that it's so important that these provisions are in the contract and they are clearly stated, especially when it comes to closing out escrow and those terms that need to be met prior to that account closing.
So yeah, that's really scary and really kind of a nightmare for the surrogate for sure. Does Seed Trust still accept clients and contracts that don't have that provision?
We do. It actually has not come up again. I mean, this is kind of one of those one-off cases to where I would say, unfortunately, until it became a problem, it wasn't a problem type scenario. But I think we all kind of learned from this. I know Seed Trust and others as well that were involved, that, that's just something vital that needs to be looked at when reviewing these contracts. And I think as an industry as a whole, we have the duty to the intended parents and the surrogates to make sure that there's certain provisions, certain, education that goes around this was being conveyed to surrogates and intended parents. That was an example of where you really learn from, and it ended up okay. Not without stress though on the surrogate's part and all those involved, but I do, the journey ended up, I believe, okay. We never heard really anything else besides that. So
wow. Yeah, that's so stressful. Wow. Okay, so
yeah.
we know how to avoid that, which is make sure in your contracts, especially surrogates, that your intended parents can't just close the account during a pregnancy.
Yes.
And that not only that, but most contracts, should be all contracts these days, anticipate a certain number of months after delivery that the escrow account has to stay open so that all of your postpartum stuff is still covered. So you want to make sure and work with your attorney, right, to put those provisions in. You cannot close it out once a pregnancy has been achieved, and it must stay open long enough to cover postpartum bills, because we all know those doctor bills take forever to come in. Postpartum counseling, any follow-ups, any complications, all the things that happen after you deliver a baby. That account needs to be accessible for all of that. So, okay, so we learned from that one. So let's talk about your next one.
Absolutely. So this kind of also ties in a little bit to the previous nightmare case, as we'll call it. But this is kind of going more in regards to that minimum balance requirement. We had another case to where that minimum balance requirement, the one that there's usually a provision within that the surrogacy agreement that states, how much funds need to remain in escrow at all times. This provision was also negotiated out of the contract. And there was a provision in its place stating that, if the account got low, that the intended parents would need to replenish the account within 10 days of the account, being low. However, this was very subjective because, what's considered low? When the surrogate's not receiving her compensations, when she's not being able to receive her payments, kind of what are the guidelines around that? Again, the contract was not specific at all. And in, this minimum balance place, it was just a provision that stated, oh, we'll replenish, those funds within 10 days if we feel that they're low. So this, again, caused significant stress with the surrogate because there was delays in receiving her compensation. There was delays in receiving her payments. She was stressed that what if the intended parents do not fund the account? What if, I can't receive funds to be able to travel, to my doctor's appointments or, childcare for when I need to go to the OB appointments. She's reaching out to her agency a lot, reaching out to escrow a lot. And legally, based off this contract, the most, all parties can kind of do is encourage the intended parents to fund, to notify them, hey, their funds are low. There's not enough funds in escrow. You need to, replenish the account. Again, so kind of touching base on these provisions, it's just so important that there is a minimum balance requirement within that contract. This is something, surrogates definitely need to also be looking for when they're reviewing those contracts. What we typically see is a minimum of anywhere from that 10 to 15,000 mark. Would not suggest going any lower than that 10,000 mark, especially with, medical bills. You just never know, or any type of situations that might arise in the surrogacy journey where, not all parties are planning on.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I owned my surrogacy agency, I required that all contracts had a stipulation that a minimum of 10,000 had to be in the account at all times. If it was an international case, that minimum was higher, usually 20,000.
Absolutely, especially for international, just because there's a little bit more expenses that can, traditionally arise from those. So,
yeah.
Absolutely. So that's really what, we recommend to be in place. And then also within this particular instance, with this case, the surrogate did end up delivering early. meaning there was additional expenses. She was on bed rest longer, childcare, housekeeping, kind of those typical disbursements that would go along with when a surrogate does deliver early. And it was just really having to reach out to the intended parents over and over to request these funds. And that's stressful for them too, because you have people, individuals keep asking you for, additional money to replenish the account. So.
Yeah, and so much of this goes back to the legal process. We have another episode of Nightmare Cases that's legal cases, and I was talking to an attorney about how important it is to have an experienced surrogacy attorney who knows what they're doing and knows that these are the types of things that have to be in the contract, because I can't imagine in this day and age in 2024 that any experienced surrogacy attorney would not have the basic premise in a contract that you have to have a minimum balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Minimum balance in the account, ensuring that the account has to remain open for a certain period of time. We recommend the account needs to remain open at least 12 months, especially since COVID. The medical bills are trickling in, could be 8 months post delivery. So it's just very important, that obviously not to put it back on how the legal contracts are written, but it really, at least for escrow purposes, it really does come down to how those legal contracts are written and to be able to, enforce that contract, in regards to escrow.
I'm not shy about saying I think that the attorneys have to be really diligent in this. And I'm sure I drove the attorneys crazy when I had my agency, because I had my hand in making sure that all of these things were in the contract before everyone signed it, because it's important. And thankfully, I worked with great attorneys all over the country that I didn't have to make sure they were doing it, because they were doing it. But things like minimum balances and making sure the escrow stays open long enough and making sure the intended parents don't have the ability to close out the account. Those are things that I would always make sure were in the contract before anybody signed.
Oh, absolutely. And, I've also had kind of this discussion with attorneys as well. And, a lot of times they say, well, we work with the agencies. And I think it really needs, this is just my personal opinion, is it really needs to come down to all of us working together to ensure that, these just, I guess I would say best practices are in place straight across the board. Agencies making sure that it's in their contracts, and attorneys making sure that it makes it to the gestational surrogacy agreement, and then an educational piece around it with the surrogates and intended parents that, hey, these are some key items that you definitely need to make sure you're reviewing and that you're okay with. And if you're not okay with, then we need to have those discussions. I feel that it's just kind of like a circle of all of us working together, in the industry, just to make sure that there are these successful surrogacy journeys, and, that these nightmare and stressors don't come up, because let's face it, no one likes to talk about money. It's just how it is. Especially they don't want issues with money, especially in a surrogacy journey, when it is a very emotional process for a lot involved. So
I agree. And for my other company, Modern Parent Mentor, where I mentor independent intended parents through the journey. So those who either can't afford to work with an agency or just choose not to work with an agency, I professionally mentor them through the journey. And I have it in my service agreement with the intended parents that if they don't hire an independent escrow service once they're matched, then I will fire them and I will not work with them anymore, because I'm not going to be part of a journey that doesn't have all of the right safeguards and best practices, including escrow, in place.
Yeah, absolutely. That is so important, especially in kind of what's been going on in the industry with escrow, is just to make sure you are, going with an independent third party escrow, making sure there's no biases there between, each party, and that those payments are going to be processed what the agreement is saying, especially ensuring that, safeguards are in place in the event of any type of mishaps that happen. It's so important for people to make sure they're doing their research and going with a company that they have the right checks and balances and that the right processes are in place to ensure for a safe surrogacy journey.
For sure. So do you have one more nightmare case for us to share?
I do. So let's see. This is kind of going on the topic of, I would say, misinterpretation of the contracts on all ends. So we had a surrogate and she had delivered, and right after the delivery, she was friends with her intended parents on Facebook. And the intended parents saw that she went to Disneyland. And within the contract, it stated that they needed to pay her post-delivery wages. And the intended mother disputed the wages because she felt that, well, why am I paying these wages if you're at Disneyland, you're not on bed rest? So there was a lot of back and forth with, the interpretation of this provision. Does she get these wages? She's at Disneyland. She's not on bed rest. And really where it came down to is that she was actually entitled to these wages because it was for the postpartum period, not for bed rest. And she wasn't actually on bed rest, but it was postpartum. But it was a nightmare because of the different interpretations of how the contract was written, and what constituted as her being on, with the bed rest or for the post-delivery wages. So
gotcha. Yeah. That's an interesting one because it's like your maternity leave, right? But you just don't have a baby to take care of. So if you're feeling great after a week or two and then you go to Disneyland on your maternity leave, like, who cares? You're still on maternity leave, and those are technically post-delivery / maternity leave payments, right?
Exactly. But that one probably wasn't as much of a nightmare as others have been. It was just a lot of back and forth, with all the individuals involved. And I think, once kind of escalated to the attorneys, and they were able to clarify what was the reasoning behind that provision. And, all parties were eventually happy with the outcome of it. But that's just kind of a case. And then I know we've had a few where it kind of ties back to Facebook, where intended parents are friends with surrogates, and she's eating McDonald's, or it looks like she's at a place that it might have cigarette smoke, and okay, now we're not paying her compensation, or we're not doing this because she's in breach of her contract. And we do get a lot of those. However, it really always goes back to the contract. And unless there's formalized breach letters in place, then the payments will definitely continue on per that agreement. So, which kind of ties also back into where it's super important to have an independent third-party escrow, just because we are non-biased to all parties, and we're just going to process those payments per the terms of that agreement.
Yeah, for sure. And you bring up an interesting point about social media. It's a tricky landmine, being friends on Facebook with your intended parents before, during, and after the journey. And so definitely want to make sure there's a clause in the agreement about what the parameters of that social media relationship is and what effect it has on the contract, if any. And yeah, because I've definitely seen intended parents get bent out of shape about things they're seeing on social media. So it's definitely something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Yes, it's great. And then also can cause a lot of problems as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I've shared this before on the podcast about my personal journey. I was an independent surrogate 11 years ago now, and I did everything myself. We did not have escrow. And I mean, we did a lot of things wrong in that sense. And I remember how stressful it was having to ask my intended mothers every month, like, did you mail the payment? When is it coming? What's the amount you're sending? Like, I managed all of it. And while it gave me a great foundation for starting a successful surrogacy agency, it was not good for my mental health at the time. And so what I could say about escrow, not only as a former surrogate who did it myself, but also as an former agency owner, and someone who's been in this industry a while is that if nothing else, escrow, having a third party escrow saves you so much mental energy of like worrying about things. Like you don't have to talk to your intended parents about money unless something happens where there's a confusion or, you know, an issue you have to solve, but you don't have to worry about it because you've already done the hard part of putting everything each party desires in the contract.
Yes.
And then that becomes the manual for how that money's managed. And you don't have to think about it. You can worry about talking about the baby and the doctor's appointments and, you know, the ultrasounds. You don't have to talk about money.
Exactly. I would always say, let us handle that part. Let us, you know, take that stress away, because there's already so much that, you know, everyone is thinking about and being pulled in different directions. And really, you know, that financial stress should be the last thing on intended parents and surrogates' minds. That's why we're here to help with that and to manage that, and, you know, just to disperse those funds and to make sure that those payments do go out accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but do you have some parting advice for people on how to avoid these nightmare cases and, you know, maybe some tips for people as they're starting their journeys and looking at escrow and all that's involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So I personally think it really comes down, you know, to education, making sure that they're asking the right questions. I mean, I would say the biggest players in escrow where it can cause the most stress is, you know, minimum balance, making sure there's enough funds in the account. That can cause so much stress with surrogates and intended parents, especially if intended parents are having to come up with additional funds towards the end of a surrogacy journey. Surrogates being stressed about receiving, you know, those compensation payments or medical bills being covered. You know, making sure that there is a time frame in the escrow agreement, that escrow needs to remain open. You know, we wouldn't recommend anything less than really 12 months, just because those medical bills have been coming in a lot later, you know, post-COVID years. And then also, I know we didn't really touch a whole lot on this, but I would say this is another area that can cause kind of some issues is lost wages, making sure there's very clear provisions in the agreement with lost wages, making sure, you know, intended parents understand it and surrogates understand it. I think that kind of, like I said before, really comes back to the industry as a whole working together, agencies, attorneys, escrow, you know, putting these best practices in place and making sure that we're educating our intended parents, educating our surrogates, and making sure that they understand, you know, really the compensation piece of everything.
I agree. And a lot of that education falls directly on the laps of agencies and attorneys and professionals who are mentoring and working with all of these parties to say, here's best practice, here's industry standards, here's what you can expect. And, you know, to that point, surrogates and intended parents should be vetting the professionals they're working with, making sure that they are actually people that are experienced and reputable and know what they're talking about. And, you know, there's several ways to do that. One of the ways is SEEDS ethics, seedsethics.org. You know, look at the Society for Ethics and Egg Donation and Surrogacy and look at the standards and guidelines and the directory and talk to professionals that are investing in education in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more with that.
Yeah. Well, it has been such a great conversation with you and learning more about escrow and what to avoid.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us and for sharing that with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carrie. It was a pleasure. And I was so excited to be able to do this with you today.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Normalized Surrogacy Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Carrie Flamer Powell. I want to again thank Kaitlyn for joining me today. Be sure to check us out online at surrogacymentor.com. If you're interested in knowing whether surrogacy is right for you, take our easy 2-minute quiz on our website. You can also learn more about our intended parent mentoring and matching services at modernparentmentor.com. Subscribe to this podcast to learn more about gestational surrogacy and how to have a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Talk to you next time.